The road stretched endlessly through the desolation of the Nevada desert, illuminated only by the cold glow of the moon. The car's headlights pierced the darkness like twin beams of fragile hope. Sarah and her boyfriend Dylan were on their way to visit her parents in a small town just outside Carson City. They had taken this route to avoid the interstate, seeking a little adventure to spice up the long drive. They hadn't seen another car for miles. The air outside was thick with an oppressive stillness, the type of silence that wraps itself around you and amplifies every creak, every whisper of wind. Inside the car, they tried to shake the unease with music and laughter, but even their conversation felt hollow. Then they saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of their headlights. Dylan slowed the car, squinting at the shadowy silhouette. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be. He was tall and gaunt, wearing tattered clothes that hung off his frame like old curtains. His face was obscured, but his posture was unnervingly rigid. "Don't stop," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Dylan hesitated. "What if he's in trouble?" "No," she insisted, clutching his arm. "Something's wrong. Just keep driving." Dylan reluctantly pressed the gas pedal. As they passed the man, Sarah couldn't help but glance back through the rearview mirror. The figure hadn't moved. He stood like a statue, his head slowly turning to follow their car. Her stomach churned. They didn't speak for a while after that. The tension in the car grew heavy, suffocating. Sarah stared out the window at the vast emptiness, but all she could think about was the man. And then the headlights illuminated something else. A car pulled over on the shoulder, its hood popped open. A woman stood next to it, waving her arms frantically. "Okay, this is weird," Dylan muttered, slowing down again. Sarah's heart pounded. "Dylan, no, this doesn't feel right." "She looks like she needs help," he argued. The woman was crying, her hands pressed together in a desperate plea. Dylan stopped the car, rolling down the window slightly. "Are you okay?" he called out. The woman's face was streaked with tears. "Please, my car. It just died. I don't know what to do. Can you help me?" Sarah's instincts screamed at her to leave. She reached for Dylan's arm, but he shook her off and stepped out of the car. "I'll just take a quick look," he said. Sarah locked the doors behind him, her fingers trembling. She watched as Dylan walked toward the woman, who backed up slightly, her expression shifting to something unreadable. The shadows seemed to swallow them both, and for a moment Sarah lost sight of Dylan entirely. Then she heard his scream. It was guttural, primal, a sound that tore through the silence and made her blood run cold. She fumbled for the door handle, torn between staying safe inside and rushing to his aid. Before she could decide, Dylan came stumbling back into view. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Drive!" he shouted, pounding on the window. "Sarah, go!" She unlocked the doors just long enough for him to dive back inside before slamming them shut and flooring the gas pedal. "What happened?" she cried, her voice shaking. "She wasn't alone," Dylan panted. "There were others. They were hiding behind the car." Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman now stood in the middle of the road, her face twisted into something grotesque, almost inhuman. Behind her, more figures emerged from the darkness, their movements jerky and unnatural. The couple sped down the road, their breaths ragged and hearts racing. But the nightmare wasn't over. No matter how fast they drove, the figures seemed to keep pace. Sarah could see them in the mirror, their distorted shapes flickering like bad static. And then the car shuddered. "No," Dylan whispered, his voice breaking. "Not now." The engine sputtered, and the car coasted to a stop. Sarah tried to restart it, but the ignition clicked uselessly. "What do we do?" she asked, panic rising in her throat. "We run," Dylan said, grabbing her hand. "We can't stay here." They bolted from the car, sprinting into the desert with nothing but the moonlight to guide them. The dry, cracked earth crunched beneath their feet as they ran, the sound deafening in the otherwise silent night. Behind them, the figures gave chase. Sarah's lungs burned, her legs threatening to give out, but she didn't dare stop. She could hear them getting closer, their footsteps uneven but relentless. Suddenly, Dylan tripped, falling hard onto the ground. Sarah turned to help him, but he waved her off. "Go!" he shouted. "Don't stop!" "I'm not leaving you," she cried, pulling at his arm. Before she could get him to his feet, the figures were upon them. Hands clawed at her, cold and unyielding. Their faces were a nightmare of twisted features, their eyes hollow and empty. Dylan fought back, kicking and screaming, but there were too many of them. "Run!" he yelled again, his voice breaking. With tears streaming down her face, Sarah obeyed. She stumbled through the desert, the sounds of Dylan's struggle fading behind her. She didn't know how long she ran or where she was going. The landscape blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Eventually she collapsed, her body unable to go any further. When she opened her eyes, the sun was rising, casting a pale light over the desert. She was alone. Her throat was raw from screaming Dylan's name, but there was no response, only the endless silence of the wasteland. She staggered back toward the road, hoping to find some sign of him, some clue as to what had happened. Instead, she found their car. It was parked neatly on the shoulder, the engine idling as if nothing had ever gone wrong. But Dylan was nowhere to be seen. As Sarah approached the car, she saw something in the driver's seat, a photograph. It was an old, faded picture of a man and a woman, smiling happily. She recognized the man immediately. It was the same figure they had seen on the road. Her scream echoed across the desert, swallowed quickly by the vast emptiness. She climbed into the car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. The engine roared to life, and she drove away as fast as she could. But no matter how far she went, the feeling of being watched never left her. And in the rearview mirror, she could still see them, those twisted, hollow faces, following her into the endless night.
Story number 2.
The clock in the gas station ticked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each second dragging on like an eternity. Lauren and her younger brother Max had pulled into the station hours ago, their car sputtering to its death just as they reached the only sign of civilization in miles. The old man behind the counter, wearing a greasy trucker hat and a permanent scowl, had told them the nearest tow truck wouldn't be available until morning. Lauren had argued, but he'd merely shrugged, muttering something about how things moved slower out here. Now it was 11:47 p.m. The fluorescent lights inside the station buzzed faintly, casting an unnatural glow over the racks of dusty snacks and faded magazines. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a yawning void of darkness interrupted only by the occasional chirp of unseen insects. Lauren sat on a plastic chair near the window, staring into the nothingness. Max, restless and annoyed, paced the aisles, occasionally swiping at a display of cheap sunglasses or tapping on the glass candy jars. The old man hadn't said much since they'd arrived, preferring to sit hunched over the counter, pretending to read a newspaper. The silence was starting to get to Lauren. "What do you think's out there?" Max asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Sand," Lauren replied, not looking up. "No, I mean, past that. You ever wonder how much nothing can exist in one place?" Lauren rolled her eyes. "Don't start getting all philosophical on me now, Max. I'm too tired." He smirked but didn't push it. Instead, he wandered to the window, peering into the blackness. His face fell. "Hey, Lauren, come look at this." She sighed, dragging herself to her feet. When she joined him at the window, her stomach sank. There was a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, just barely visible in the dim light of the gas station sign. "Who the hell?" Lauren muttered, squinting. The figure didn't move. It stood unnervingly still, its outline humanoid but indistinct, as though the shadows were warping it. "Think they need help?" Max asked. "More like they're about to murder us," Lauren whispered. Max chuckled nervously. "Should we tell the guy?" He gestured to the cashier, who hadn't moved from his spot behind the counter. Before Lauren could answer, the figure took a step forward, then another, and another. Its movements were stiff, almost mechanical, like a puppet on invisible strings. "Okay, that's enough of that," Lauren said, grabbing Max's arm and pulling him away from the window. The old man finally looked up as they approached the counter. His eyes, clouded and weary, flicked to the window, then back to them. "What's wrong?" he asked gruffly. "There's someone outside," Lauren said, trying to keep her voice steady. "They're acting weird." The old man frowned. "Weird how?" "Like stiff, like they're not human." The man sighed, setting down his newspaper. "Stay here," he said, shuffling toward the door. "Wait," Lauren protested, but he was already outside, stepping into the cool desert night. Through the window, they watched as he approached the edge of the parking lot, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The figure was gone. The man scanned the area for a moment, then came back inside, locking the door behind him. "Nobody there," he said simply. Lauren shook her head. "No, we saw someone," the man shrugged. "Desert can play tricks on you. Shadows. Mirage." "Mirage?" Max repeated, incredulous. The old man ignored him, retreating to his post behind the counter. "Y'all, I'll best get some rest. Tow truck will be here at first light." Lauren and Max exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't argue. They returned to their chairs by the window, this each pretending not to keep an eye on the darkness outside. Minutes passed, then an hour. At some point, Lauren dozed off. When she woke, the gas station was silent. Too silent. "Max," she whispered, looking around. Her brother was gone. Panic surged through her as she stood up, scanning the room. The old man was slumped over the counter, unmoving. Lauren ran to him, shaking his shoulder. "Hey, wake up!" He didn't respond. She leaned closer and saw the reason why. His throat had been slashed, a pool of dark blood spreading beneath him. Lauren stumbled back, her heart pounding. She spun around, her eyes darting to the door. It was wide open, swaying gently in the breeze. "Max!" she screamed, running outside. The parking lot was empty, the desert stretching endlessly before her. She took a few shaky steps forward, her breath hitching in her chest. And then she saw him. Max stood about 20 feet away, his back to her. Relief flooded through her as she rushed toward him. "Max! Thank God! We have to!" She stopped abruptly. Something was wrong. His posture was too rigid, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Max?" she said hesitantly. He turned slowly and Lauren's blood ran cold. It was Max's body, but his face wasn't his. It was blank, featureless, like a mannequin. Where his eyes and mouth should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. The thing wearing Max's body raised one hand, beckoning her forward with a slow, deliberate motion. Lauren screamed and bolted back toward the gas station. She slammed the door shut, locking it and pushing a shelf in front of it for good measure. The lights flickered overhead, the buzzing growing louder and more erratic. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. Then the scratching started. It was faint at first, like nails on glass, but it grew louder, more insistent. Lauren looked at the window and saw them, more figures, dozens of them, their featureless faces pressed against the glass. They didn't move, didn't blink, they only stared, as though waiting for something. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, plunging the station into darkness. Lauren's breaths came in shallow gasps as she backed further into the room, her eyes struggling to adjust. Then she heard it, a low, guttural whisper, impossibly close. "Lauren," she turned, but it was too late. The last thing she saw was her own reflection in the glass of the snack display, her face pale and terrified, and behind it, the smooth, blank visage of something inhuman. The gas station was empty when the tow truck arrived the next morning. The lights were still on, the old man's body gone, and the car outside looked untouched. The only sign that anyone had been there at all was a single handprint on the window, smudged, featureless, and impossibly large.
Story number 3.
The rain came down in heavy sheets, turning the narrow, winding road into a slick ribbon of asphalt. Jenna gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she leaned forward to see through the blurry windshield. Her phone had lost signal miles ago, and the GPS was no longer offering helpful directions. She cursed under her breath. What was supposed to be a quick shortcut to the lake house had turned into a labyrinth of unmarked roads and thick woods. The night pressed in around her, the rain hammering against the car like impatient fingers. Then through the haze of rain, Jenna spotted a sign. It was old, the paint peeling, but she could just make out the words, "Willow Hollow, 5 miles. Relief washed over her. Civilization at last. She followed the road, her tires splashing through puddles. The forest on either side of her seemed to close in, the trees looming like silent sentinels. A flash of movement caught her eye. Jenna slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. Someone had darted across the road. She squinted into the darkness but saw nothing. The rain continued to pour, and the rhythmic sweep of the wipers offered no clarity. "Just a deer," she whispered to herself. "Or maybe a coyote." She pressed the gas and continued, her nerves jangling. A mile later, she saw it again, a figure standing on the side of the road, barely illuminated by her headlights. It was a woman, drenched, her hair plastered to her face. She wore a tattered white dress that clung to her thin frame. Her head was tilted downward, her face obscured by the curtain of wet hair. Jenna slowed the car, hesitating. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, as though waiting. Against every instinct, Jenna rolled down the window slightly. "Are you okay?" She called out, her voice shaky. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even flinch. Jenna's stomach twisted. Something about this wasn't right. She rolled the window back up and pressed on the accelerator, leaving the woman behind. But as she drove, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Her headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the forest seemed to press closer with every mile. She kept glancing in her mirrors, convinced that she would see the woman again. And then she did. She was in the rearview mirror, sitting in the back seat. Jenna screamed, swerving the car wildly. She turned around, but the back seat was empty. Her chest heaved as she struggled to control her breathing. "It's just your imagination," she whispered, gripping the wheel tightly. "You're tired. That's all." She tried to focus on the road, but her hands were shaking. The forest broke suddenly, and she found herself in a small, decrepit town. The buildings were old and leaning, their windows shattered and roofs caved in. The streets were empty, and not a single light glowed in the windows. Jenna slowed to a crawl, her headlights sweeping across the derelict storefronts. A gas station sat on the corner, its sign hanging by a single chain. She pulled into the lot and parked. Inside the station, the air was stale and thick with the scent of mildew. The shelves were nearly bare, save for a few dusty cans and faded candy wrappers. "Hello?" Jenna called out. Her voice echoed unnaturally. There was no answer. She walked to the counter, hoping to find a map or a phone. Instead, she found a newspaper, yellowed and crumbling. The date was from 1972. The headline made her blood run cold. "Tragedy strikes Willow Hollow, 10 dead in bus crash." Beneath it was a grainy photo of the wreckage, the bus crumpled like a tin can. The article detailed how the vehicle had skidded off the road in the rain, plunging into a ravine. All passengers, including a group of school children and their teacher, were killed instantly. Jenna's fingers trembled as she set the newspaper down. Her eyes flicked to the door, suddenly desperate to leave, and then the bell above the door jingled. She spun around, but no one was there. The door was open, the rain still pouring outside. "Hello?" she called out again, her voice cracking. A faint giggle echoed through the store. It was high-pitched and childlike, but it sent shivers crawling up her spine. Jenna backed away, bumping into the counter. The giggle came again, closer this time. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice barely more than a whisper. A shadow moved in the corner of her eye. She turned, but it was gone. The lights in the station flickered, buzzing loudly. Then she saw them. Children. At least a dozen of them, standing just beyond the reach of the light. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow and black. Their clothes were tattered and soaked, water dripping onto the floor beneath them. "Leave me alone," Jenna pleaded, her voice trembling. The children didn't move, but their mouths began to open, too wide, stretching into impossible grins. The giggling grew louder, overlapping and echoing until it filled her ears like a maddening symphony. And then the teacher stepped forward. It was the woman from the road. Her face was gaunt, her eyes like two empty sockets. Her dress clung to her skeletal frame, and her wet hair hung in clumps. She raised a hand, pointing directly at Jenna. "Join us," the teacher said, her voice a raspy whisper. The lights in the station exploded, plunging the room into darkness. Jenna screamed, scrambling toward the door. She burst outside, slipping on the wet pavement as she ran to her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking violently. Finally, the engine roared to life. Jenna slammed on the gas, speeding out of the town. The rain blinded her, the road a slick blur. She glanced in the rearview mirror, praying that she was alone. But she wasn't. The children were there, their faces pressed against the glass, their black eyes staring into her soul. The teacher's voice whispered in her ear, "You'll never leave." Jenna screamed as the car veered off the road, plunging into the darkness. The last thing she saw was the grinning faces of the children, welcoming her into their eternal rain-soaked nightmare.
Story number 4.
The clock struck 2:13 a.m. when Victor realized he was lost. His GPS had rerouted him several times after he left the main highway, guiding him onto increasingly narrow and unpaved roads. Now he was deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees that cast long, skeletal shadows under the glow of his headlights. The air inside the car was stifling, heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. He hadn't passed another vehicle or seen a single light in over an hour. "This has to lead somewhere," Victor muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. The gravel road crunched under his tires as he pressed forward. Then, just as abruptly as it had begun, the road ended. A large metal gate blocked the way, its iron bars twisted into a design of spiraling vines and sharp thorns. Hanging from the gate was a weathered wooden sign that read, "Black Hollow Asylum, closed indefinitely." Victor's stomach churned. He'd heard stories about Black Hollow as a kid, the kind of urban legends that small towns thrive on. It had been an asylum for the criminally insane, abandoned decades ago after a fire gutted most of the facility. Rumors of experiments, missing patients, and ghostly sightings were a staple of local folklore. But this was no time to dwell on old ghost stories. He needed to turn around and find his way back. Victor shifted the car into reverse, but as he did, his headlights flickered. "Come on," he groaned, tapping the dashboard. The lights dimmed again, then went out completely, plunging him into darkness. Victor sat frozen, his breath hitching. The car engine sputtered and died, leaving only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "Great! Just great!" he muttered, grabbing his phone. He unlocked it, only to find that it had no signal. He turned on the flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the inky blackness. Steeling himself, Victor stepped out of the car. The cold night air bit at his skin as he moved toward the gate. He shone the flashlight down the road, hoping to see a clearing or a structure, anything that might indicate help. But instead, he saw footprints. They were fresh, leading away from the gate and into the woods. The prints were large, human-like, but the spacing was unnatural, too far apart as if whoever had made them was running. Victor's pulse quickened. He glanced back at his car, tempted to lock himself inside until daylight, but the thought of staying stranded in these woods all night was just as terrifying. Against his better judgment, he followed the footprints. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees growing denser with each step. The beam of his flashlight wavered, casting long, jagged shadows that danced and twisted. The air smelled of decay, thick and cloying. Then he heard it, a faint sound like whispering. Victor froze, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and indistinct, like dozens of voices speaking at once. He spun around, the flashlight beam trembling as he searched for the source. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, something crashed through the underbrush behind him. Victor whirled around, his heart pounding. The flashlight caught movement, a figure darting between the trees. It was fast, too fast to be human. Victor stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing. The whispers started again, louder this time, and with them came a soft, rhythmic tapping. Victor shone the flashlight toward the sound and saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood at the edge of the light. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs elongated and contorted. Its face was obscured by a tangle of greasy black hair. In one hand it held a stick, tapping it against a tree in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Victor didn't wait to see what it wanted. He turned and ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he crashed through the woods. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more frantic. The tapping stick was replaced by heavy footfalls, faster and heavier than his own. He burst through the tree line and into a clearing. Before him loomed the ruins of Black Hollow Asylum. The charred remains of the main building jutted into the sky like skeletal fingers. Windows gaped like empty sockets, and the front doors hung ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. Victor had no choice. He ran inside, slamming the doors behind him. The interior was worse than he'd imagined. The walls were blackened with soot, and debris littered the floor. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and something metallic, like rusted iron. Victor crouched behind an overturned desk, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. He could hear the thing outside, its footsteps crunching closer. Then, to his horror, the whispers began again, inside the asylum. Victor held his breath, his pulse hammering in his ears. The whispers seemed to come from every direction, echoing through the crumbling halls. "Victor!" one voice called, low and raspy. His blood froze. "How do you know my name?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The flashlight flickered, then died. In the darkness, he felt something cold brush against his arm. He screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the flashlight. He scrambled to his feet, running blindly through the asylum. The whispers turned to screams, high-pitched, agonized wails that reverberated off the walls. The air grew colder, and Victor could feel something chasing him, its breath hot on his neck. He burst into a room at the end of the hall, slamming the door shut behind him. The screams stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Victor turned, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through a shattered window. The room was filled with old hospital beds, each one covered in a sheet. One of the sheets moved. Victor backed away, his heart racing. Another sheet moved, then another. Slowly they began to rise, shapes forming beneath the fabric. The door behind him creaked open. Victor didn't turn around. He couldn't. A voice, low and guttural, whispered directly into his ear, "You shouldn't have come here." The last thing Victor saw was the sheets falling away, revealing faces that weren't faces at all, just empty voids where eyes and mouths should have been. And then the darkness swallowed him. When Victor's car was found days later, there was no sign of him. The locals who dared approach Black Hollow claimed they could still hear the whispers in the woods, and on rainy nights they swore they saw a flashlight beam weaving through the trees, always followed by the sound of a tapping stick.
Story number 5.
The winding road through the Appalachian Mountains was notorious for its treacherous curves and dense fog that seemed to swallow travelers whole. Emma had heard the stories, tales of missing hikers, eerie apparitions, and inexplicable noises that echoed through the night. But she dismissed them as local legends, products of too many lonely nights on the road. She was driving home after visiting her grandmother, whose house sat on the outskirts of a small town nestled deep within the mountains. The journey had been uneventful until the sun began to set, casting long shadows that danced between the towering pines. As darkness enveloped the landscape, Emma decided to take a shortcut through a less-traveled path, hoping to save some time. Her car's headlights pierced the thickening gloom, revealing nothing but endless rows of trees and the occasional overgrown fence. The radio played softly, a mix of old classics that provided a comforting backdrop to her solitude. Emma glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:47 p.m. It was later than she had anticipated, but she was confident she'd make it home before midnight. Suddenly, her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A text message from her best friend, Lily. "Did you hear about the old Miller house on Pine Ridge? They say it's haunted." Emma chuckled, shaking her head. Lily always had a penchant for ghost stories. Probably just another one of your made-up tales, she thought, dismissing the message as she continued down the deserted road. As she rounded a particularly sharp bend, the fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to mere feet ahead. The road seemed to narrow, flanked by dense thickets that obscured any sign of civilization. Her unease grew. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the engine and the distant hoot of an owl. Out of the corner of her eye, Emma caught a fleeting glimpse of something moving between the trees. She slowed the car, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. Probably just a deer, she reassured herself, though her heart raced a little faster. Minutes passed, and the road remained empty. Just as she began to relax, her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Emma slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a sudden halt. The figure was cloaked in shadow, indistinct and tall, with no discernible features. "Hello?" she called out, her voice wavering. "Is everything okay?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the dense forest on her right. Emma's pulse quickened. She glanced back at her phone, the text from Lily still glowing on the screen. A chill ran down her spine. Without warning, the figure began to move, slowly advancing down the road. Emma's instincts screamed at her to leave, but the road behind her was as empty as the one ahead. She reached for the gear shift, preparing to drive away, but something made her hesitate. I don't understand, she stammered, unlocking the car door and reaching for her keys. The figure stopped just a few feet away, raising its hand again, this time beckoning her to follow. Emma swallowed hard, her mind racing. She considered turning around, but the road seemed to stretch on infinitely in both directions, each path equally dark and foreboding. Against her better judgment, Emma felt a compulsion to follow. She parked the car on the shoulder, her hands trembling as she grabbed her flashlight and stepped out into the night. The rain had started, soft at first, then growing into a relentless downpour that obscured everything around her. The figure led her into the forest, the rain soaking her clothes and making the ground slippery underfoot. Emma's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced among the trees. The path they followed was narrow and overgrown, barely visible beneath the deluge. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated house, the very Miller house Lily had mentioned. Its windows were shattered, and the once white paint was now peeling and faded. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she took in the sight, a sense of dread settling over her. The figure gestured toward the house, then turned and began to fade into the mist. Emma reached out instinctively, but her hand met only cold air. She took a hesitant step forward, the front door creaking ominously as she pushed it open. Inside, the house was dark and silent, the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing broken furniture and remnants of lives long abandoned. As she moved deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop, her breath visible in the cold air. In the main hall, she found a dusty staircase leading to the upper floor. As she ascended, the sound of dripping water echoed through the empty rooms. At the top, a long corridor stretched before her, lined with doors that led to bedrooms and bathrooms now forgotten by time. At the end of the hallway stood a single door, slightly ajar. Emma approached it cautiously, her heart racing. She pushed it open, revealing a small room bathed in a dim, ethereal light. In the center stood a single rocking chair, slowly moving back and forth as if someone invisible was sitting there. Suddenly, the room grew unbearably cold. Emma wrapped her arms around herself, shivering uncontrollably. The air thickened, making it difficult to breathe. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Panic surged through her as she pounded on the door, shouting for help, but her voice seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. The rocking chair stopped abruptly, and a figure materialized in front of her, a translucent apparition of a woman, her eyes hollow and sorrowful. "Why did you come here?" the ghostly figure whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Emma backed away, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean any harm. I was scared and lost." The apparition's expression softened slightly. "Leave now, before it's too late." Emma didn't need to be told twice. She turned and fled down the hallway, the door refusing to budge. Desperation clawed at her as she searched for another exit, her flashlight flickering wildly. Finally, she found a window at the end of the corridor. Without hesitation, she climbed through, the cold rain rushing in as she tumbled onto the wet ground outside. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, drenched and trembling. Fumbling with the keys, she managed to unlock the door and dive inside, slamming it shut just as a bolt of lightning illuminated the sky. The engine roared to life, and Emma sped away, the Miller house disappearing into the fog behind her. As she drove, her mind raced, replaying the night's terrifying events. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in once more. She glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ghostly figure following her, but the road remained empty. Finally, just as dawn began to break, Emma saw the familiar lights of her hometown ahead. Relief washed over her as she navigated the last few miles to her grandmother's house. She pulled into the driveway, the warmth and safety of home a stark contrast to the horrors she had endured. But as she stepped out of the car, she felt a cold breeze brush against her neck. She turned slowly, her heart sinking as she saw the Miller house standing in the distance, unchanged and ominous. And there, in the window, was the apparition of the woman, her hollow eyes staring directly at Emma. Frozen in fear, Emma watched as the ghostly figure raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "You should have stayed away," the voice echoed, fading into the morning mist. Emma stumbled back, her mind unable to comprehend what she was seeing. She ran inside, locking all the doors and windows, but the image of the haunted house and its sorrowful ghost lingered in her mind, a haunting reminder that some shortcuts lead to places best left forgotten. From that day on, Emma never took that road again. But sometimes, on foggy nights, she could still hear the distant sound of a rocking chair, a ghostly whisper carried on the wind, reminding her of the night she ventured too far into the darkness and encountered the restless spirits of Willow Ridge.
Story number 6.
The road stretched endlessly before Jenna, a thin ribbon of asphalt cutting through desolate farmland. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and now only her car's headlights illuminated the empty landscape. Cornfields bordered the road on either side, their tall stalks swaying gently in the night breeze, creating the illusion of shifting shadows. Jenna hated driving at night, but she'd had no choice. A last-minute family emergency had her racing across state lines, trying to make it to her sister's house before morning. Her GPS had chosen this back road as the fastest route, but she was beginning to doubt its wisdom. She hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour, and the isolation was beginning to gnaw at her nerves. The first sign of trouble came as a subtle flicker of her dashboard lights. Jenna frowned, glancing down as the lights dimmed, then flared back to full brightness. Her car had always been reliable, and she hadn't noticed any issues before. But now the engine sputtered, and the headlights dimmed momentarily before stabilizing. "Come on, don't do this now," she muttered, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Then she saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road, just at the edge of her headlight's reach. Jenna's heart jumped, and she instinctively slowed the car. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching as her car approached. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in outdated clothing, a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow. Jenna's stomach twisted. Something about him was wrong. His posture was too rigid, his stillness unnerving. As her car crept closer, she realized his face was pale, almost unnaturally so, and his eyes reflected the headlights like an animal's. Her instincts screamed at her to keep driving, and she pressed the accelerator, steering wide to avoid him. But as she passed, the man's head turned slowly, tracking her with those reflective eyes. A chill ran down her spine, and she gripped the wheel until her knuckles turned white. When she glanced in the rearview mirror, the man was gone. Jenna's pulse quickened. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had stepped back into the cornfield. Maybe her tired mind was playing tricks on her. But the unease lingered, an oppressive weight in her chest. A few miles later, her car sputtered again, and this time the engine cut out completely. The headlights faded, leaving her in pitch-black darkness. Jenna cursed under her breath, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The engine cranked but refused to start. She grabbed her phone, hoping to call for roadside assistance, but her heart sank when she saw the dreaded "no signal" message. She leaned back in her seat, trying to steady her breathing. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the faint rustle of the cornfields. Then she heard it, a soft tap on the window. Jenna froze, her blood running cold. Slowly she turned her head, her eyes straining to see through the darkness. For a moment she saw nothing. Then faintly, the outline of a handprint appeared on the fogged glass, smudged and too large to be human. Panic surged through her, and she locked the doors, her fingers trembling. The tapping stopped, replaced by a scraping sound, like nails dragging across the metal of the car. Jenna's breath hitched, and she fumbled with her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty road and swaying cornfields. She exhaled shakily, trying to convince herself that the sound had been the wind, or her imagination. But then the cornfield rustled violently, and a shape emerged. It was the man she had passed earlier. Or at least it looked like him. His face was wrong, though. His features were blurred, as if smeared by invisible hands, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dark. He moved unnaturally, jerking forward in abrupt staccato motions that made Jenna's skin crawl. "Help," he rasped, his voice distorted like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Please, help," Jenna screamed and turned the key in the ignition again, praying for the engine to start. It sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. She didn't wait. Slamming the car into gear, she sped away, the tires kicking up gravel as she tore down the road. Her heart pounded as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The man stood in the middle of the road, his glowing eyes fixed on her retreating car. Then, impossibly, he started to run. His movements were unnatural, too fast for a human, and he gained on her despite the speedometer climbing past 60. Jenna's vision blurred with tears of terror as she pressed the pedal to the floor, the car hurtling down the narrow road. The man vanished from the mirror, but she didn't slow down. Her entire body was shaking, and she couldn't trust what she'd just seen. Was she losing her mind? The road curved sharply ahead, and Jenna barely managed to take the turn, her tires skidding on the asphalt. Her breath came in short gasps as she steadied the car, her eyes scanning the road for any more signs of him. And then, as if in defiance of logic, he was there, standing in the middle of the road ahead, his distorted face staring directly at her. Jenna screamed, yanking the wheel to avoid him. The car veered off the road, crashing into the cornfield. The impact jarred her, and the world spun as the car came to a halt among the towering stalks. Everything was silent again. Jenna's head throbbed, and her hands trembled as she unbuckled her seatbelt. She tried to start the car, but the engine only groaned in protest. A faint noise caught her attention, the rustling of corn growing louder and closer. She turned her head, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the stalks parting, something moving toward her. She grabbed her flashlight and scrambled out of the car, stumbling through the cornfield in a desperate attempt to escape. The rustling followed her, relentless and deliberate, the sound of something large moving just out of sight. Jenna burst into another clearing, her flashlight illuminating an old crumbling farmhouse. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung ajar, swaying in the breeze. She had no choice. She ran inside, slamming the door behind her. The house was a nightmare of decay, peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and a foul smell that made her gag. She moved deeper into the house, her flashlight beam flickering as she searched for a place to hide. The rustling outside grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Jenna found herself in a small, windowless room and locked the door behind her. She sank to the floor, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, her ears straining for any sound. For a moment, there was only silence. Then faintly, she heard the whisper, "You can't run forever." Her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness.
Story number 7.
The night was cold and moonless as Caleb drove down the lonely highway, his car slicing through a heavy blanket of mist. The road was unlit, and the shadows of the dense woods on either side seemed to reach out toward him. He had been driving for hours, the monotony of the journey broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the cry of a distant animal. His destination, a remote cabin where he planned to spend a quiet weekend alone, was still miles away. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, its faint light briefly illuminating the otherwise dark interior of the car. Caleb glanced at it. Warning, severe weather advisory. He frowned but dismissed the notification. The mist was already a sign of worsening weather, but he was determined to make it to the cabin tonight. He couldn't shake the feeling that the sooner he arrived, the better. Something about the dark, deserted road unsettled him. Ahead, the mist grew thicker, swallowing the weak beams of his headlights. Caleb slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The road twisted and turned unpredictably, each curve hidden in the ghostly fog. His nerves were fraying when he spotted something in the distance, a faint glow. At first, he thought it might be another car. But as he drew closer, the glow resolved into a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a woman, barefoot and dressed in a thin, white gown that clung to her as though she had just emerged from water. Her hair hung in wet, tangled strands over her face, obscuring her features. Caleb's heart lurched. He braked sharply, stopping just a few feet from her. She didn't move, didn't flinch. The glow surrounding her was unnatural, faintly pulsing like the dim light of a dying bulb. He rolled down his window. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" He called out, his voice trembling despite himself. The woman tilted her head slightly, but she didn't answer. Her presence was wrong, unsettling in a way Caleb couldn't articulate. He felt as though the mist itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. She raised her hand and pointed, not at him, but at the dense woods to his right. Caleb followed her gesture, but saw nothing, just the endless expanse of trees and fog. When he turned back to her, she was gone. The air in the car felt suddenly suffocating. Caleb stared at the spot where the woman had been, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? A trick of the fog and exhaustion? He didn't believe in ghosts, but he couldn't explain what he had just seen. The unease lingered as he drove on, the road growing narrower and more treacherous. He couldn't shake the image of the woman, her wet hair, and that eerie glow. His hands were slick with sweat, and the hum of the engine felt unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. Then, his headlights caught something again, a flash of white darting between the trees. Caleb slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He scanned the woods but saw nothing. His pulse thundered in his ears as he inched forward, his eyes darting between the road and the shadowy forest. The cabin, he reminded himself. Just get to the cabin. But the forest seemed alive now, the mist curling like spectral fingers around the trees. Shadows flitted at the edges of his vision, always gone before he could fully see them. The road stretched on interminably, as if mocking his growing desperation. Finally, after what felt like hours, he saw the turnoff to the cabin. Relief flooded him as he turned onto the gravel driveway, the crunch of rocks beneath his tires a welcome sound. The cabin was dark, a small, weathered structure nestled against the edge of the woods. Caleb parked and stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin. The silence here was even more profound, the kind that pressed against his ears and made him feel acutely alone. He retrieved his bag from the car and approached the cabin, his footsteps crunching loudly in the gravel. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and he fumbled for the light switch. The single bulb flickered to life, casting a weak glow over the rustic interior. The cabin smelled of damp wood and old stone, but it was warm, and the promise of safety calmed him somewhat. Caleb set his bag down and locked the door, double-checking it before drawing the curtains. He wanted to block out the darkness, the mist, the memory of that woman on the road. He busied himself making coffee, the familiar routine grounding him. But as he stood by the window, staring out into the night, something caught his attention. A faint light moved among the trees, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably real. It was the same glow he'd seen around the woman. Caleb's chest tightened. He backed away from the window, his coffee forgotten. The light grew brighter closer until it stopped just beyond the tree line. He waited, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed on the spot where it had vanished. And then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant. 3 gentle raps on the cabin door. Caleb froze, his heart thundering in his chest. He hadn't heard anyone approach. The gravel driveway was silent, undisturbed. Whoever or whatever was outside shouldn't have been able to reach the door unnoticed. The knock came again, louder this time. Caleb grabbed a flashlight and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. No response. The silence stretched, oppressive and heavy. Caleb gripped the doorknob, his hand trembling, and swung it open. No one was there. The mist swirled lazily in the cold night air, and the porch was empty. But as Caleb stepped back inside, he noticed something chilling. A single, wet footprint on the wooden floor, leading into the cabin. He spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the shadows. The room was empty, but the footprint was unmistakable. His mind reeled. How had it gotten there? The door had been locked. He had checked it himself. The lights flickered violently, plunging the cabin into brief, jarring darkness. When they steadied again, Caleb saw her. The woman stood at the edge of the room, her hair dripping onto the floor, her gown clinging to her emaciated frame, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, and her eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto his. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice hollow and cold. Caleb stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. The woman moved toward him, her steps silent, her presence suffocating. She reached out, her fingers long and claw-like, her face contorted into a grimace of pain and fury. The last thing Caleb remembered was her touch, ice-cold and searing all at once, pulling him into a darkness deeper than the night outside. When rescuers arrived days later, the cabin was empty, the door hanging open and the air inside thick with an unshakable chill. Caleb's car was still parked outside, his belongings untouched, but of him there was no trace. Only a single wet footprint leading into the woods, vanishing among the mist.
Story number 8.
The bus stop sat in the shadow of a massive oak tree, its bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. It was late, far later than Grace wanted to be out alone, but her evening shift had run over, and she had missed the earlier bus. Now she stood in the oppressive silence of the empty street, the faint hum of a flickering street lamp the only sound. She checked her phone for the umpteenth time. 11:57 p.m. The last bus of the night was due any minute. She hoped it wasn't running late. The thought of being stranded here sent a shiver down her spine. The quiet suburban neighborhood felt different at night, unnatural, like the world had shifted into something darker, more sinister. A chill breeze swept through the street, and Grace pulled her coat tighter around her. She glanced down the road, hoping to see the distant glow of the bus's headlights. Instead, she saw a figure walking toward her. At first, she was relieved. Another person. Someone else waiting for the bus. But as the figure came closer, her relief curdled into unease. The person moved oddly, their gait uneven, almost mechanical. Their head was tilted to one side as though they were struggling to keep it upright. Grace's grip tightened on her phone as the figure reached the edge of the street lamp's light. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes that looked decades out of style. His face was pale, too pale, and his eyes seemed unfocused, staring past her as he walked. Despite the cold, sweat gleamed on his forehead. He stopped a few feet away and stood there, swaying slightly. Grace's mouth went dry. She forced herself to speak. "Are you waiting for the bus too?" she asked, her voice hesitant. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with labored effort. Grace took a step back, her pulse quickening. The sound of the bus approaching broke the tension, its engine a low rumble that echoed through the empty street. Grace exhaled shakily, relief flooding her. She stepped closer to the curb, eager to board and leave the unsettling stranger behind. The bus pulled to a stop, its doors hissing open. Grace climbed aboard, casting a wary glance over her shoulder. The man hadn't moved. He stood frozen in place, his unfocused eyes locked on the bus. Shaking off the encounter, Grace found a seat near the middle of the bus. There were only a handful of other passengers, a tired-looking woman clutching a shopping bag, an elderly man dozing against the window, and a teenager with headphones blaring tinny music. The driver, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, closed the doors and started down the road. Grace leaned back, trying to calm her nerves. But as the bus moved, she noticed something strange. The man at the stop hadn't stayed behind. He was walking in the same direction as the bus, his jerky movements visible through the window. She frowned. There was no way he could keep up with the bus. Yet as they turned onto another street, he was there, walking, always walking, at the same unnatural pace. The teenager with the headphones noticed it too. He pulled one earbud out and muttered, "Weird," before glancing at Grace. She nodded, her unease mirrored in his expression. The bus made another turn, this time onto a long stretch of road lined with darkened houses. Grace glanced out the window again. Her stomach dropped. The man was still there, his form illuminated by the passing streetlights. He wasn't running, wasn't even breaking a sweat. He was just walking, and somehow he was keeping up. The other passengers began to notice. The elderly man sat up straighter, squinting at the window. The woman with the shopping bag clutched it tighter, her knuckles white. The driver glanced in his mirror, his brow furrowed. "Probably just some nut," the driver muttered, but Grace could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The bus sped up. Grace watched as the houses blurred past, her heart pounding. Surely this would be enough to lose the man. But when she looked out the window again, he was there, closer now, his pale face briefly illuminated in the window's reflection. She couldn't take it anymore. "Who is that? How is he keeping up?" she asked, her voice trembling. The driver didn't answer. He pressed harder on the gas, the bus lurching forward. The passengers exchanged nervous glances, their collective fear palpable. The streetlights began to thin out as the bus entered a more rural area, the darkness pressing in around them. Grace stared out the window, searching for any sign of the man. For a moment, she thought they'd finally outrun him. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, a rhythmic tapping against the side of the bus, like fingers drumming on the metal. The passengers froze, their eyes darting toward the windows. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving along the length of the bus. The teenager stood and yanked the cord to signal the driver. "Stop the bus, man! Let me off!" The driver didn't stop. "I'm not opening those doors until we're at the station," he said, his voice tight. The tapping stopped abruptly, leaving a deafening silence. Grace's breath caught as she noticed something moving in the aisle. The man was inside the bus. He stood at the back, his head tilted at that unnatural angle, his unfocused eyes scanning the passengers. No one had seen him get on. No one had heard the doors open. The teenager screamed, bolting toward the front of the bus. The driver swerved, trying to keep control as the other passengers pressed against their seats, their faces pale with terror. The man moved down the aisle, his steps slow and deliberate. His presence was suffocating, an aura of cold that seemed to suck the air out of the bus. He stopped in front of Grace, his milky eyes meeting hers. "You shouldn't have gotten on this bus," he said, his voice a guttural whisper. Grace couldn't move, couldn't speak. The world around her seemed to blur, the other passengers fading into shadows. The man reached out, his fingers brushing her arm. His touch was icy, burning, and then darkness. When Grace woke, she was lying on the bench at the bus stop, her bag clutched to her chest. The street was empty, the mist gone. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out. 12 a.m. There was no sign of the bus, no sign of the man. But as she stood, shaking, she noticed something etched into the bench where she had been lying. Next time, don't ride. Grace didn't wait to find out what it meant. She ran, leaving the empty street and its chilling silence behind her.
Story number 9.
The mountain road was treacherously winding, its edges crumbling into steep ravines. Lila kept a firm grip on the wheel, her eyes straining to see through the darkness. The headlights of her car barely cut through the thick fog that blanketed the area. The trip had been unplanned, a last-minute decision to drive to her grandmother's cabin after a tense argument with her boyfriend. Now the isolation seemed like both a curse and a relief. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, but she ignored it. There was no service this far into the wilderness, and the GPS had already abandoned her hours ago. Lila glanced at the dashboard clock. 11:42 p.m. She was sure the cabin wasn't far now, but the dense fog made every mile stretch endlessly. The road narrowed, and she slowed down further. Trees loomed on either side, their skeletal branches weaving together overhead, creating a tunnel-like effect. The atmosphere was oppressive, the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. A shadow darted across the road ahead. Lila slammed on the brakes, her heart hammering in her chest. The car skidded to a stop, and she stared into the mist, searching for what she had seen. A deer, a fox. But the shadow had moved too quickly, too fluidly, and its shape had been wrong. Almost human, but not quite. The car's engine hummed softly, the only sound breaking the heavy stillness. She waited, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. After a moment, she convinced herself it was just her imagination. She eased her foot off the brake and pressed the gas. The car crept forward, the tires crunching on the gravel road. Lila glanced in the rearview mirror out of habit and froze. Someone was standing in the middle of the road behind her. She couldn't make out the details, but the figure was tall and motionless, their outline barely visible in the fog. Panic surged through her. She pressed the accelerator harder, the car lurching forward as she sped away. Her breathing came in shallow gasps as she glanced in the mirror again. The figure was gone. She tried to calm herself, convincing herself it had been a trick of the fog and shadows. But her grip on the wheel tightened, and her eyes darted between the road and the mirrors. Minutes passed. The road grew darker, the trees denser. Lila's unease deepened with every passing second. Then she saw it again, something moving just ahead. This time the figure didn't dart across the road. It stood at the edge, partially obscured by the trees, watching her. She couldn't make out the face, but she felt its gaze, cold and penetrating. Her instincts screamed at her to keep driving, to not stop for anything. Her foot pressed down harder on the gas, the car speeding past the figure. She kept her eyes forward, refusing to look back. But then came the sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping against the back window. Tap, tap, tap. Lila's stomach churned. She didn't dare look. The sound continued, growing louder, more insistent. She gripped the wheel, her knuckles aching, and focused on the road. The tapping stopped abruptly. Her heart pounded as she risked a glance in the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. The road behind her was shrouded in fog, devoid of any sign of life. She let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with adrenaline. Ahead, the road split into two. Lila cursed under her breath. There had been no mention of a fork on the way to the cabin. She slowed the car, peering at the unmarked paths. Both seemed identical, shrouded in darkness and lined with the same ominous trees. As she debated which way to go, she heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, the sound came from the passenger window. Lila's head snapped toward the noise. A face pressed against the glass, pale and distorted, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. The eyes were hollow, black voids that seemed to suck in all the light. She screamed and floored the accelerator, the car veering sharply as it sped down the right-hand path. The face disappeared, but the image was seared into her mind. Her hands shook violently as she tried to control the car, the tires screeching on the gravel. The tapping resumed, louder now, echoing from every side of the car. The windows seemed to vibrate with the force of it. Lila's vision blurred as tears streamed down her face, panic clawing at her chest. "Leave me alone," she screamed into the void. The sounds stopped. The silence was deafening, more unnerving than the noise had been. Lila slowed the car, her breath hitching as she wiped her face. She glanced around, the road eerily quiet again. That's when she noticed the cabin. It sat at the end of the road, its wooden structure barely visible through the fog. Relief washed over her, mingled with dread. She didn't feel safe, but at least she was no longer on the cursed road. She pulled into the small clearing and parked the car. Lila hesitated, her hand on the door handle. She scanned the surrounding woods, her senses on high alert. There was no movement, no sound. Summoning her courage, she stepped out of the car and hurried to the cabin door. The air felt heavier here, thick and oppressive. Her hands fumbled as she unlocked the door and pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, but it was shelter. She closed the door quickly, bolting it behind her. The cabin's interior was simple, a single room with a bed, a small kitchenette, and a fireplace. She grabbed the flashlight from her bag and swept the beam across the room. Everything appeared normal. No signs of anyone or anything else. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, her body trembling. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself it was over. She was safe now. Then she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came from the window beside her. Slowly, against every instinct screaming at her to run, she turned her head. The face was there, pressed against the glass, the same hollow eyes, the same twisted grin. Only now it was closer, clearer, and it was inside the cabin. The flashlight slipped from her hand as the figure stepped out of the shadows, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its grin widened impossibly, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. "You didn't pick the right road," it rasped, its voice a guttural whisper that seemed to echo in her skull. Lila's scream was swallowed by the darkness as the cabin door swung open, letting the fog pour in like a living thing.